Hey everyone, Azim here. The lymphatic system and immune-related structures. It's related to the circulatory system. It's kind of circulatory adjacent, but it's its own thing. And so we'll see how it exchanges things with the circulatory system and with other systems of the body. Histology will be important in this chapter, and as well as identification of different organs, gross anatomy. We'll be talking a bit about the immune system here too. So we talked about lymphocytes before and other types of leukocytes like macrophages. Those will show up here again. So the lymphatic system is kind of an intersection between the circulatory system, immune system, and its own thing. We'll see the histology of different things like lymph vessels, lymph nodes, the thymus, spleen, Peyer's patches, and among others. When I think of the lymphatic system, I think of sewage and water treatment. It's not the most glamorous thing, but it's very needed. When you have a city, a town, you have all this excess water. Here's excess water going into a sewage drain. You don't want that to accumulate in the streets. That would flood your streets. So whether it rains or you're washing your car, stuff gets run off into the streets. And you don't want it to stay there forever, so you collect it. When you collect it, you don't want to waste the water. You also don't want to have anything bad that's been collected from running in the streets or like whatever you use to wash your car. You don't want that to pollute your water supply. You don't want that to pollute the environment. So you take that water and you run it through special processes. You filter it, you treat it with other things. There's tons of processes that I'm not entirely familiar with, but water treatment plants do a lot to keep your water clean and healthy. Filter it, you disinfect it until you can have water that's now usable. So you go through a lot of steps from this runoff water. So now that it's usable, you can store it and drink it again, and it's all good. This process of taking runoff water in the streets and clearing it up and using it again is a lot like what we have in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system takes runoff fluids from the circulatory system and takes those fluids, filters them, and returns it back to the circulatory system. I've mentioned before how the circulatory system, continuous capillaries, sinusoid capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, they all leak. Even continuous capillaries have leaky junctions. They're leaking into interstitial fluid. If you continually leak, then you keep swelling up, and you don't want that. You need to return that fluid back. And as long as you're returning it back, you might as well filter it too. That's the goal of the lymphatic system. When I say filter, what we're filtering for are pathogens. Pathogens means things that generate badness. That's what pathogen means. Pathos means bad. Gen means, word down. Pathogen. Pathos means bad. Gen means generate. So bacteria can be pathogens. Viruses are pathogens. Parasites are pathogens. We want to use the lymphatic system as an immune part of our immune system to get rid of these pathogens. We are maintaining fluid balance, maintaining balance between plasma and interstitial fluid, and we're transporting things around because it's fluid moving around, just like what we saw in the circulatory system. Many things happen in the lymphatic system that are super important. The lymphatic system is important for producing, maintaining, and distributing lymphocytes. We talked about lymphocytes previously, those cells with really large nuclei, nice round nuclei, nice round cell. It was the plainest looking of the leukocytes. And that's where the lymphocyte name comes from. They're cells of the lymphatic system. So we'll see how they play a role here in the lymphatic system. They help maintain blood volume and interstitial fluid volume. If these blood vessels continually leak, we increase interstitial fluid. We don't want to continuously increase interstitial fluid, so we want to return that back. So we want to maintain a balance. Too much interstitial fluid, that leads to edema. Edema is just the fancy way of saying swelling. If you bump your head on something and you get a big bump on your head, and it starts to swell up because you hurt yourself, that's swelling, that's edema. That edema has occurred because there's been an excess of fluid coming out of blood vessels into that interstitial fluid tissue area for purposes of healing. But if you have an increase of fluids not for that reason, that's a problem. So we'll talk more about fluid balance coming up. Not only can the circulatory system, not only can your blood circulate nutrients and hormones and wastes, so can the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is great at distributing these things as well. Certain nutrients are better suited. Certain nutrients are better suited for transport in the lymphatic system, namely lipids. Lipids are primarily transported through the lymphatic system. Fats. We don't transport things like carbohydrates, like glucose or proteins, amino acids. Those get transported in the blood, but lipids get transported in the lymphatic system. And you can see here that on the right side here, the lymphatic system is it branches just like the circulatory system does, but these are not the same things as blood vessels. These are lymphatic vessels, what you mostly see. And then we also see some bulging things here. These are lymph nodes. And then this is not an exhaustive list, but we can see some lymphatic organs like tonsils, the thymus, the liver is a lymphatic organ as well as a digestive organ, and the spleen. The lymphatic system consists of organs, vessels, and the fluid. The fluid is called lymph, and the lymph is continuously circulating. It doesn't have a heart to pump the lymph throughout, so it's low pressure fluid flowing throughout and relies on your body movement to move it around, but it still can move around. So there's several organs that we're going to be going over, namely bone marrow, thymus, spleen, lymph nodes, and a few others. Again, lymphatic vessels everywhere throughout your body that help drain fluid, help drain lymph back to venous circulation. Lymphatic fluid returns back to the blood vessels, specifically to veins, at a very specific part of our body. It's going to be up here. And then lymph is basically a specialized interstitial fluid. Remember, we've talked about 3 fluid compartments. There's intracellular, there's interstitial, and there's plasma. Plasma is within blood vessels. Interstitial fluid is not within blood vessels, but it's not within cells. So lymph is technically interstitial fluid, just interstitial fluid within lymphatic vessels. Lymph also contains cells, and it contains lymphocytes and macrophages because, like I mentioned, we want to filter our fluids for pathogens. If we're taking fluid out of blood anyways, we might as well look through it to see if there's anything that might harm us. So let's dive right in and take a look at important lymphatic organs. There are 2, what we categorize as primary lymphoid tissues. Primary lymphoid tissues. The definition of a primary lymphoid tissue is an organ that produces lymphocytes. We've talked about where lymphocytes are made. Lymphocyte, a type of leukocyte. All blood cells, including lymphocytes, are made in red bone marrow. Red bone marrow we can find in between trabeculae, in between spongy bone, there we go, in between spongy bone, mostly within flat bones, the ends of long bones, and the epiphyses. In red bone marrow, one major lymphocyte that you can produce, we haven't gone over types of lymphocytes, we are now. One is called a B lymphocyte. You might see it called B cell, it's the same thing. B lymphocytes are produced here in red bone marrow. If we It's not actually pictured here in this diagram, a lymphocyte, but let's pretend this stem cell could produce a lymphocyte, because it can. So there we have a lymphocyte. Into the sinusoid capillaries. The B in B lymphocyte is referring to bone marrow. So in red bone marrow, B lymphocytes are produced. And B lymphocytes, what they do, if you're curious, I won't test you on this, but what these cells do is that they produce antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that help fight off pathogens. How they do that, you'll talk about in physiology. It gets more technical than that, of course, but the gist of it is it helps fight off pathogens. So that's our first primary lymphoid tissue. And I just want to remind you that we have seen the histology of red bone marrow. You've got your stem cells and you've got your megakaryocytes. Where's megakaryocyte? There we go. Got your megakaryocytes. So that will be important to identify. Our second primary lymphoid tissue is the thymus gland. The thymus gland, not the thyroid. Those are two different things. The thymus, take a look down here, sits just superior to the heart. Compare that with the thyroid. Thyroid is more superior around the larynx and trachea. So it's not the thyroid, it's the thymus that we're talking about. The thymus, it doesn't exactly produce lymphocytes, but what happens is some lymphocytes made in the red bone marrow, because all lymphocytes are made in red bone marrow, some of the lymphocytes made in the red bone marrow make their way to the thymus and they can mature there. A special type of lymphocyte, T lymphocytes mature in the thymus. And that's where the T comes from, T for thymus. T cell, T lymphocyte, same thing. What T cells do, there's actually a few kinds. What they do, one thing is they can help coordinate immune responses. That's a very vague answer right there, but they can basically tell other cells what to do. They act like leaders. They tell other immune cells in your body what to do. And then some T cells can kill your own infected cells. If one of your cells is infected with a virus, you want to kill that cell right away because it's going to just produce more and more virus. So best thing you can do is kill it before it does that. The thymus gland is just posterior to the manubrium, just sitting on top of the heart, superior to the heart. It is most active when you're younger. As you age, it's pretty much done doing its work. So in your youth, this is a critical time for developing immunity. In most people, there's some exceptions. In most people, the thymus actually kind of disappears when you get older. The tissue gets recycled and then it's replaced by fat. So when we look at our cadavers, you're unlikely to find a thymus. You're probably just going to find fatty tissue sitting in that area. And you might be wondering, where's the thymus? Well, they don't have one anymore. And that's normal. Most people, some exceptions, most people don't have a thymus in adulthood. What the thymus looks like under the microscope, take a look at the right side here. First, let's look at this zoomed out version that I just circled. You've got cortex areas. Remember, the word cortex just means outer portion. It's not perfectly outer portion. You can see some of the cortex kind of goes in a little bit. You've got cortex portions, and then you've got medulla portions. In the cortex specifically, in the cortex, you've got lymphocytes. So the reason why the cortex is darker, because you have more lymphocytes, and those lymphocytes have nuclei. So these lymphocytes are sitting in the cortex maturing, and then they'll get released to the bloodstream when they're ready. There's one other cell type here. They're called reticular cells here. These are basically fibroblasts. There's reticular connective tissue. It hasn't been stained for here, so you can't see it, but most of these lymphatic organs have reticular connective tissue. Red bone marrow, I didn't show it here, but red bone marrow has reticular connective tissue. Lymphoid, the thymus gland has reticular connective tissue. We'll see that lymph nodes do as well. So those are our two primary lymphoid tissues. What about secondary lymphoid tissues? Now, there are several secondary lymphoid tissues. And a secondary lymphoid tissue is a place where these newly made lymphocytes, whether we have B lymphocytes or T lymphocytes, newly made lymphocytes are able to interact with pathogens. So when they were in bone marrow or thymus, they're just getting made. When they're released into the bloodstream and then make their way to the lymphatic system as well, they can start actually doing their jobs, attacking, coordinating, killing. They've gone to war, so to speak. The first one that we're talking about here, the first secondary lymphoid tissue, is the spleen. The spleen is, let me use a different color. No, that won't work. I'm going to use black. The spleen is sitting to the left upper superior portion of your stomach. It kind of looks like a kidney. It's not the kidney. The kidney is actually over here, but it's not shown here. You have only one spleen sitting on the upper left quadrant and the left hypochondriac region. Don't forget about those abdominal pelvic regions. It receives blood via the abdominal aorta. So here's the abdominal aorta. Celiac trunk. I forgot celiac trunk here. To the splenic artery. And then you reach the spleen. Within the spleen, you have sinusoid capillaries. Recall that we have sinusoid capillaries here because not only is the spleen for searching for pathogens and filtering those out, but also for destroying old red blood cells, old erythrocytes. Both of those things happen here, and you need large capillaries to let erythrocytes into the spleen. When we exit, we come out, not shown here, we come out the splenic vein to the inferior vena cava. When you look at the histology of the spleen, you'll notice that it has regions that are darker than others. Mostly, you see this, I'm just kind of skimming over it. Mostly, you see this kind of pinkish area. And in this pinkish area, it's mostly reddish pink with specks of dark purple. The specks of dark purple are macrophages because they have nuclei. And the reason why it's pinkish red, it's because it has erythrocytes. And erythrocytes don't have nuclei, so they're not going to stain purple. They're not going to stain dark. These are the old damaged erythrocytes, and the macrophages are there to eat up. They're there to phagocytose the erythrocytes, recycle them, recycle the parts. That's the red pulp. I guess I should use red. That's the red pulp of the spleen. It's what you see in most of the spleen. But then you're going to see pockets where it's a bit darker. I should use a different color. Where it's a bit darker, where I'm circling in white. Where it's a bit darker, you don't have erythrocytes. You don't have erythrocytes to make it look lighter colored. What you see instead here are not macrophages, you see lymphocytes here. These lymphocytes gather together in a circular arrangement, which are termed as white pulp. This is termed as white pulp. And in the white pulp, like I mentioned, you have lymphocytes. And here, this is the portion that's destroying pathogens that you may have found in your lymphatic fluids. So the spleen both destroys old red blood cells, recycles them, and can find pathogens and destroy those too. The outer portion, which I'm highlighting in green, the outer portion is the capsule. Many of these organs have capsules, just a protective barrier on the outside. And this is always going to be reticular connective tissue. Spleen is red pulp and white pulp, different functions. Tonsils. Tonsils are found in your oral nasal cavity. Your oral nasal cavity is a region of your body where you have high exposure to things from the outside world. We're constantly breathing in. We often eat and swallow things. And while we might want to breathe in pure air or eat good food, sometimes you'll get things that we don't want. Debris in the air, viruses, whatever. Those are things we don't want getting into our bodies. One of our first lines of defense are tonsils. Tonsils have nodules. We'll explain what these lymph nodules are here in a second. They contain nodules that contain lymphocytes. I guess that's really all there is to explain. Nodules of lymphocytes to filter what we inhale and ingest. Just like what we saw white pulp, those rounded regions where you have a bunch of lymphocytes, here you have these rounded nodules or follicles, you can call them too. These rounded regions, let me circle it better. These rounded regions where we find lymphocytes. The center of a lymph nodule is called the germinal center. This is where more lymphocytes can duplicate themselves, or just lymphocytes can duplicate. We can make more lymphocytes. I know we said we originally make lymphocytes in the red bone marrow and thymus. That's where we can make unique ones, but we can make clones. And clones can be made here in germinal centers of follicles. So really the process that's going on here is mitosis. This is the region of mitosis of these lymphocytes. We can make more in response to, if we have an infection, we'll get more here. Which is why if you have an infection in your throat region, one thing that can swell up are your tonsils. And we'll talk about lymph nodes too, those can swell up as well. There are 4 different tonsils in your nose throat region. The one that's most superior, take a look at this mid-sagittal cut. The one that's most superior, shown right here, is the pharyngeal tonsil. Pharyngeal. There's only one. There's only one pharyngeal tonsil. So it's hiding in your nasopharynx. You might see it called the adenoid tonsil. It's the same thing. There are 2 tubal tonsils, and this is surrounding, let me write this over here. This is in the nasopharynx. The tubal tonsils are surrounding entry to auditory tubes. Palatine tonsils are the ones, let me circle that. Palatine tonsils are the ones that you can actually see in the back of your throat. So if you take a look down here and say, ah, you can see these two bulges on either side. You stick your tongue out. Those are palatine tonsils, and it makes sense. Palatine is by the palate of your mouth. Posterior, like the base of your tongue, underneath it, really far back, you have lingual tonsils. Or yeah, you have two lingual tonsils. Lingual means tongue. For any of these tonsils, the organization is the same. You have a capsule, and capsule is with reticular fibers, reticular connective tissue. And then you've got lymph nodules, lymph follicles, same thing, surrounding mostly the outside, and they are there to filter anything that you might have ingested or inhaled. Just as our nasal cavity and oral cavity are regions of high interface with the outside world, so is any tract. Your respiratory tract, your gastrointestinal tract, your urinary tract, your reproductive tract. They are all open to the outside. These are all mucous membranes. Another way to say mucous membrane is mucosa. And you have lymphoid tissue associated with this mucosa. Throughout the mucosa, you can sometimes see a lymph nodule here, a lymph nodule here, a lymph nodule here. They just pop up sometimes because we want to occasionally filter anything that might have come along. So this is called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Anywhere there's mucosa, it's actually deep to it. So it's mucosa associated, but it's deep to the mucosa layer. So it's actually found in the submucosa. For example, take a look at the colon histology here. Colon is your large intestines. You can see this layer that I'm highlighting in green. This is the simple columnar epithelium layer. You can't, it's really hard to see an individual cell. We're kind of zoomed out here, but individual cells are coming down like this. Each box I'm drawing is one simple columnar cell, and it comes back up the same way. We're forming structures that look like this with these cells to maximize the surface area. We're producing lots of mucus here. But anyways, that's the mucosa layer. Down here, which I'm going to draw in black, down here, that's our lymph nodule found in the submucosa. Similarly, in the esophagus, which is on the right side here, in the esophagus, we have our non-keratinized stratified squamous of the mucosa. But deep to that, in the submucosa, we have our lymphoid follicle, lymphoid nodule in the submucosa. Here it's darker because you have a bunch of lymphocytes in these lymph nodules. So this is going to be a common theme for these secondary lymphoid tissues. You see lymph nodules full of lymphocytes, as well as macrophages, lymphocytes and macrophages. Both are super helpful in filtering out any pathogens that come by. Now, let me go back real quick. You can find mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue in the large intestines. You can find it in the esophagus. You can find it in the uterus. You can find it in all these different tracts. There are certain places where it's heavily, where there's a high amount of these lymphoid nodules. One place is the ileum. The ileum is the third part of your small intestines. And you have a high amount of mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, lymphoid nodules in this region. Because there are so many, it has a name. They're called Peyer's patches. If you look in this cross-section, you can see all of these lymphoid nodules of the Peyer's patches that I'm circling here. Those are Peyer's patches. Lymphoid nodules called Peyer's patches. In this longitudinal section, and a bit more zoomed in, you can see these lymphoid nodules, also in the submucosa. It's important that we have it in the intestines because we're absorbing things at this point. We're absorbing nutrients. If we're absorbing nutrients, we also risk absorbing pathogens, and we don't want to do that. We'd rather get rid of them here, these lymph nodules. Let's take a look at this picture here on the right first. What's missing here, what's been cut away, and you can see a cut right here, is the small intestines. So this is supposed to be the end of the first part of the small intestines. It's going to wrap around, form the second part, keep going, and form the third part. And here's that third part that's been cut. And that's the ileum here, which has those Peyer's patches. If you keep going, that food will continue, or whatever food you haven't absorbed will continue from the ileum into what's called the cecum. And hanging off of the cecum, I'm going to draw this in dark blue, hanging off of the cecum is this weird little worm finger-like projection called the appendix. The full name is the vermiform appendix, literally means worm-like appendix, vermiform appendix, worm-shaped. So a lot of people, me included, have had their appendix removed because it's gotten infected, and that is a huge problem. But when it's working properly, similarly with tonsils, when they're working properly, they can serve to filter pathogens when they don't get clogged up and get infected. You can see a cross section here, and you can see lymph nodules in the histology here in the submucosa. So the appendix is this pouch-like structure at the junction of the small and large intestines. It can serve, when working properly, as a way to filter out pathogens, and it may have it may store useful bacteria, that the probiotics, the good bacteria that can help us digest stuff. There's one more secondary lymphoid tissue, but we're going to go over in the next video. There are lymph nodes. We'll see how lymph nodes interconnect lymph vessels, and that helps spread fluid throughout our body. And as the fluid spread, it gets filtered through the nodes and gets back to veins so that we can recirculate that fluid. So one more video here in the lymphatic system. I'll see you in the next video. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.